Good morning, everybody. I feel like I'm going to be a bit of an old school presentation this morning because when Eric asked me yesterday to step in, I thought, well, I'll just talk about, because I'm considered to be an expert in metadata standards, structural standards, for example, and there's a lot of discussion today and yesterday about unstructured metadata and considering all the data like the examples we just saw. But what struck me is like most of the metadata that's being discussed is about the content and content discovery, which is fabulous and exciting. But what concerns me as an archivist by training, and my company Digital Bedrock, we do digital preservation of these assets, is what kind of data do you need to capture in order to preserve these assets if you want to use these cat videos in the future? And so that's what I want to talk about. Talk about metadata standards that exist now. And I'm actually kind of curious how many of you in the audience, because I know there's a lot of folks here from VR communities, if you even know what any of these standards are. And because I think that will be a good point for me in my education as well. Talk about maybe we've gone past metadata standards. We don't need metadata standards anymore. And so that's what I want to focus my talk on today. So again, as I mentioned, I'm concerned about metadata that's required for long-term preservation and access. Think about films that were created 100 years ago. We can still see them today. The videos, the VR, the content that's being created today, what if we want to use them still in 50 or 100 years? Have retrospectives of a certain Google firm who maybe created virtual reality content. What did it look like in 2016? So what kind of data do you need to capture in order to be able to retrieve those assets? Now, of course, in 100 years, there's going to be all kinds of machine learning. I'll be dead. But anyway, the virtual Linda at that point, I'll be out of a job, at that point. So let's talk about this and what we need to know about those assets. So the first thing you need to know, of course, is the content. What is this thing, which we spent a lot of time talking about yesterday and also today. And so I think we don't necessarily need to worry about that so much in the future, except for very basics. You need to know that this is a certain cat video, because as we know, we'll be able to search and have all that discovery through other means, through machine learning, through all of those automatic processes, down to the frame level. But then all the other things after this, 2 through 6, that is what you need to know in order to preserve and provide access to that data in the future. So let's take it back from 100 years. Let's talk about now. You are putting money, you're putting investments into creating content that you might want to be able to repurpose even in 5, 10 years. So this data is really critical to capture. You need to know what is this item, and by item I'm talking about this digital object, the file. What exactly kind of format is it? What software dependencies does it have in order to render it? How was it even created? What was used to create it? That file, was it open source software? Did you develop it yourself? Did you have to license or you're using other software? Operating systems. Then you want to know about what can you do with this content and the item, and I'm separating those two actually, so you have to kind of like do the whole Cartesian mind-body split here. So the content is a thing that you're actually using, you're viewing. It's gone with the wind, the film, the entity itself, the essence. Then you have the item, and the item itself, that's the manifestation of that content, the embodiment of it. So you could have then, for example, you have the 35mm nitrate negative, or you can be watching a streaming video on your camera. So those are the different items of the content. So then, what can you do with the content and the item? That's the rights. The content, you might have intellectual property rights associated with that, but the item itself, whether it's a negative or a different digital file, what can you do with that item itself? Where is that item if you want to be able to use it or preserve it? Is it stored on a server somewhere? Is it up in the cloud? Is it on a data tape? Is it on a drive? Where is it? So you can actually access it and preserve it. And then, critically, who's touched that item? What events surrounded it? Who has been involved in creating it? Who has used it? Who's downloaded it? What has been done with that item? And you need to know all of that information in order to preserve the content, because it's the content that's critical, not necessarily the file, but that content lives as a file, a digital object somewhere. So in order to keep that content alive, you have to keep that digital file, its embodiment, alive over time. So that means you need to know all this metadata about it. So in general, I'm going to go a little bit into standards and then kind of like spread out from there. So generally standards, they all kind of go around these metadata buckets, what I call buckets of data. So you always have a unique ID associated, somehow with an object. And then you have data about the content. That would be applicable to all items. Gone with the Wind, it is still the film, whether you see it as a nitrate 35 millimeter Technicolor print, or if you see it as a digital file. It's still the same content as it's running through. What about and so that's usually then descriptive metadata is associated to the content, or all of those tags that we were just looking in the previous demonstration. That's describing the content, not the actual item itself, the asset itself. So that's called descriptive metadata. And then you have administrative metadata. That's the legal information, any contracts, access, distribution data. So that still is related to the content. Now you go into the item. And so that's where you need to know, what is this file or the object? What is its function? Is it the raw camera file, if it's coming out of a camera? Is it a distribution master? What is it? The technical metadata, that's the technical characteristics about the file itself, about the digital object. Again, it should be everything from like the frame rate if it's camera, what is the format, all of that information. Preservation metadata is separate from technical metadata because that is what's critical, because to keep that digital file alive over time, quite often you should have, not quite often, but you should have some kind of checksum that's going to be checking and verifying over a schedule that there's been no bit loss, that you're checking the health of that file. You also want to monitor obsolescence risks, which is what we really focus on in Digital Bedrock. So you want to know exactly, okay, so if it's this format that this content lives on, what are its vulnerabilities in order to render this file in the future? If the software becomes obsolete, the software depends on an operating system, which depends on hardware, which depends perhaps on a file system. So all of those vulnerabilities, if one of them becomes vulnerable, is no longer supported, that means your digital object, your content, is at risk for obsolescence. And then, of course, security. So you want to be able to capture keys around the security, around the encryption. Then there's workflow around that. So many systems you want to track, how was this created, and all of the approval process as you go through, any movement of that file, any events surrounding that digital item as it was being created. So that's a lot of metadata potentially within these buckets that you would need to be capturing in order to preserve this and access it in the future. So the kind of data that you can be capturing, you have structured metadata, and that's usually where the metadata standards come into play, because they're all talking about structured metadata that's recommended that you follow or use. Then you have the unstructured metadata, and I'm also including the embedded metadata here. So the embedded metadata would be the technical characteristics about the file that you can extract off of it. You might have descriptive metadata embedded in the file, like an EXIF data, camera, or like the director data. Title, GPS data. You have data in the asset, that's the content, that's like what we just saw. What was this frame about? What that you can capture, that you can get off through machine learning to be able to know the visual data, or out of the text if you have OCR. What's the data within the content, not the item, the content. Then, of course, sometimes you don't have all this structured metadata. All you have is you have the file name and the folder structure. And so I include that under unstructured because it isn't specifically put there in a structured data system, but yet it is data that's helpful for you to be able to find and figure out the provenance and how that content was created. So metadata standards, as I mentioned, that's usually around structured metadata. And so I don't know if you can see the details there. So on I do a lot of work in metadata, and I teach it, and I've been involved in standards creation. So these are just the standards that are on my laptop that I've done research and study on. And actually, there are subfolders within some of those standards, and then it goes down. There's another one underneath Video MD at the bottom. So that's just on my computer, and there are a whole lot of other standards that are out there that you would want to perhaps keep an eye out on. So in the media and entertainment community, these are the common standards, structural standards that you will see that are out there. So in descriptive metadata, Dublin Core, you guys know about Dublin Core? Yes? Okay, this is really helpful. So raise your hand if you know about it. EBU Core. Okay, PB Core. SEMPTI Core. I'm actually on the committee for SEMPTI Core. Yeah, all right. It's not yet out there approved, but it's in process. Movie Labs Common Core. Okay, IDER, EN15907. Crickets. That's a new standard. That is a film archive standard. So folks who actually have like pretty much physical assets, it's an international standard, and FIAF, the International Federation of Film Archives, is behind it. But it's actually a really interesting standard unto itself. So the vast majority, the most hands were Dublin Core, I would say, and then followed by EBU Core and Movie Labs Common Core. EBU Core and PB Core, actually, just to let you know, those of you who are interested, they're actually working on a project to normalize because they're those two standards into one because they're so similar. All right, technical metadata. These, and again, these, of course, those other standards, these guys, all of them have some technical metadata there, but they aren't focused on technical metadata. The ones under the technical bucket here, those focus on technical metadata. So SEMPTE RP210, I love it. How many of you guys know SEMPTE RP2? It's like over 2,000, 3,000 elements of technical metadata you can capture about objects. It's really cool, very granular. I love granularity. Okay, EXIF data comes off the camera. Yeah, okay. And then product manufacturers, Arri, for example, the Arri camera, they are very open with their metadata that they capture for their cameras, which is very important. Preservation data, Premise. Any of you know this is the only preservation metadata standard? Okay. Library of Congress developed that, and it is actually a really important standard. And then unique IDs, there are standards around unique identifiers. ISAN, yep. IDER, yep. The same hands being raised, DOI. Okay, yep. UMID, all right, C4, okay. Alrighty, what this tells me is that all of you out there who work in virtual reality, you know, machine learning, all that stuff, you could really care less about standards, about metadata standards. You don't use them, you don't know about them. And that's actually really important for me to know, you know, because I actually want to be able to preserve virtual reality content, and I'm seeing that you guys don't have any standards out there, which is cool, because I don't think you really need to have a standard, but it presents an interesting problem for us in how to preserve your content. Oh, and local data structures, that just means like everybody has your own local metadata structure, right? Yeah, everybody knows about that. Okay. All right, so are we in a post-metadata standard world? I would say yes, because standards have been developed to fill a need, and it's usually standards that because you're collecting metadata that goes into a database. And so again, all the folks who are more interested in like the content creation, content data, you might not necessarily need to have that in a database because that's really more geared towards now. The user wants to find content, so it's more on the fly content rather than having to be put into a database. So the standards were developed to share data, to also have guidance, you know, if you want to have a structured database. Interoperability of devices, that's really critical, so that also gets into technical metadata. But really with so many standards, it's usually then just don't even worry about it. If you have a database where you need to push data out to another system, for example, you want to push data out to IDER, then I think it's much more helpful just to build the system that you need, look to the standard for guidance, but make sure that you can map to these other standards so you can push out the data as required. The unstructured metadata is more difficult, and again, this is the interesting problem. For those of you, again, we're thinking not about the consumer using the content right now. You're thinking about in 15, 20, 25 years, you might want to repurpose, remonetize the content you're creating today, and you don't have any structured data about it because it's mainly like just create the thing, put it up there, people use it, and they can use all these really cool machine learning tools that are being developed. So the problem there, though, is, again, how to find it later on. How can you merge together a database or some kind of system or merge systems so you can preserve these assets using all of that data, you know, that's being created now? And that's a problem. And so you can extract the technical metadata, you can add the preservation about the files, you can add preservation metadata, you know, which, you know, again, how was this file created, the software, the operating system, all of that information. How do you save all that data, or do you need to save all that data that we just saw in the previous demonstration, all that content metadata? You know, perhaps you don't need to really save that data. What if Google goes out of business? You know, not likely, but what if you can't access all that data that's being stored in other systems that's being created? You probably don't need to worry about it because there are going to be other systems later on as far as the content goes, but it's all this other information you need to pull off the files to preserve that asset, that object later on. So I wanted to just give a quick example about mapping. So I mentioned like mapping is pretty critical for those of you. I'm going to go really fast on this one because I think it's obvious that the vast majority of the audience doesn't care about this. So let's see. So let me see if this is going to work. How can I switch to the Excel? This should be, I'm going to an Excel spreadsheet. Right on my screen right now, on the computer I have it. So while this has been worked on, so not only do I have this company, Digital Bedrock, where we do digital preservation for people, so it's not like a software where you do it yourself, we take care of all that work for you. But I've done a lot of work in metadata over the years, as I mentioned, and so I've done metadata audits for people, for different entities, broadcasters, for the most part, some studios. And what they want to know is, okay, we're building our own system now, our database. We have all this data that's living in different departments, content creators and producers, whatnot. We want to merge all that data into this system. We want it to map to those existing standards. We want to make sure that it's mapping to PB Core, EBU Core. And then I'm going to go back to the presentation. So you'll be around to help me. I won't be long here. At least I try to make it pretty. It's Excel spreadsheet, yes, but there are pretty colors in it, so it's not too boring. Let's see here. Oh, except I can't move. I need to move on it. I don't see the spreadsheet here. I've lost my...
You have to do it here.
Oh, there it is. Thank you. OK, got it. OK, so this is an example of one of the clients I had. It was a public broadcaster. They said, we're building our new system. We have all this data sitting around in other databases. We want to merge it together. It has to map to PB Core. And then I have other folks who said, oh, we also need it to map to Premise or EXIF or EBU Core or whatever, or IDER. So as long as you have a data dictionary, you can do this. This is why I'm saying it's like, as far as like feeling like you have to use a specific standard in your database, you don't need to, as long as you can map to it. And you have a really clear path of where things map to. So this spreadsheet is basically to help them, okay, the sections by identifier, and then you have titles, et cetera, et cetera. And so they've just allowed me to actually show this to you, except I anonymized it. This is what they want to have in their media asset management system. They had to map it into a consolidated, a consortium database as well. So they need to have that data. It had to map to PB Core. So even though they might call something here, it's going to, this is the equivalent of PB Core. So you can just see here, mainly what I'm focusing is here. As long as you can know what the equivalent is, and so this is a case where they had shared databases. They had a ProTrack system, shared CMS. Then the units, basically here, units are the different production units. So two of them had Access database, 3 had Access databases. Still images was just IPTC and InMagic database. Rights and clearances had their own data they wanted to have. A lot of them had unstructured data, and so what I had to do was say, okay, why in the world have people who have been producing stuff for 25, 30 years, you're not going to have them sit down and create data in a database. They have it there. It's just that it's in Excel documents or in Word documents. And so here's what you can do to pull out the data from within those documents and then map it into the system so you don't have to do things all over again. It goes on for a bit, unit, and it's all unstructured. And then they said, okay, and then give us maps to all these different systems so that we know that it's in an IDER. I just added IDER so you can see an example of IDER. You can have movie labs. You can do anything as long as it's mapping across. You can then, instead of having a whole separate data schema for IDER and a whole separate one for your internal database, you have one database and then you just map it out. You export it out to other systems. So you only have one core system. So this is just an example of how they have standards, they have their own internal needs, and they can just map it out to any other standard. And that's cool. Okay, now I'm going to go back to here. So as I mentioned, so Digital Bedrock is a system that I've developed. It's a company where we do digital preservation for clients. And what we need to do is capture what the client just gives us their assets, meaning like the actual files, and then they give us whatever metadata they might have, and we don't care what structure it's in, we just map it into our system. We're totally agnostic as far as the data format, we're agnostic about the metadata format. And then we are pulling off all of the unstructured metadata that we can off those assets themselves, pulling out any data that's embedded in it and any data that about the file name, for example, and also the directory structure. So what we do in order to do all of these steps, every single one of these steps requires metadata. And I'm using this as an example, not as a pitch for Digital Bedrock, but to show you an example about how you can pull out this data to help you preserve the assets. So we need to know about all that metadata about the file, how was it created. In order to monitor it, we need to have checksums, and we need to monitor those and verify them over time. We have offline copies for security and also for cost expediency on LTO7, which means we need to know exactly where a file is on which tape, which barcode, which is then in a certain case, which is then in a different geographic location. That's all metadata. And then the clients have their portal so that they can actually view their metadata about that we have on their assets, so they can see what we're doing, and also request files. So here's just an example then for one file where we've extracted some technical metadata, and this is just the beginning of this one file. You guys can see it. There's 469 elements of data that were pulled off this file. And so we've mapped them all, and all of these elements are indexed. So we can go in there, we can search for files for specific profiles, for 4444XQ for ProRes. You can search for, like, again, the format, the width, the height, and all that stuff. It's all indexed, all this technical metadata. We basically throw every single extraction tool that's out there that we can do, and so that's why we pull off data, because what we've discovered, for those of you who are using technical metadata, is not every tool pulls off the same data about the same element. That's why we throw everything at it. FFProbe might not pull out the same things as media info. So for example, we're adding now this, we're going to be at NAB, so we're adding a version for ARRI. As I mentioned, ARRI's great and very open with its digital cinema cameras. They have a meta extractor tool, and they're just now, we're on CentOS 7, that's what our system's built on. So they're just now adapting their meta extractor tool for CentOS 7. So you're eventually going to see the ARRI meta extractor there. So what we can do here, again, because we want to be able to map it, and so we have all these different tools that we're using, and we're saying, okay, gosh, you have 469 bits of data. You don't want to have to go through search to find, a video width. You just want to know what's the width across. So then we can map that attribute. So the next time something comes through, we know that media info, if it calls video 1 meaning the stream, is width. So we're going to map it to frame width. So then what the user can do also is then on their portal, all they have to do is search frame width. They don't have to go through all the 469 bits, because the user can also search for this data on their portal as well. Okay, so, and then you can see here that we have a mapped metadata section here. So now if you search the frame, you'll see that down at the very bottom, frame width has been added to our mapped metadata. So we also extract out metadata, embedded metadata in the file, not just the technical metadata. So again, these are sample files from ARRI and from other sources. So we did a search for the name Geistiger, because Adi Geistiger was one of their guys out in Germany who created some of these sample files. We don't have any descriptive metadata, no spreadsheet, no nothing that has his name in it. But because we pulled out his data, we could do a search for Geistiger, and we see, okay, there are 3 files here that have Geistiger associated to it. And then we can look there and say, look, Geistiger, we can see where the values are for Adi Geistiger. That was pulled out from inside the file. He was the cinematographer, the production info director. So this is a way of just, again, pulling out data in the file that it was not in the metadata, that this is a descriptive metadata that was provided. We made it, it's dummy data, of course, but that we imported in. You can see here that in the system, again, you're going to be getting data from different sources. So we have data that was provided to us from the client, that's the origin client file, and then they said, oh, we need to add another title. So you can have multiple titles, you can have multiple fields, and it shows there that the digital archivist added a title element. So we're always tracking that whole provenance about who added the metadata. Preservation metadata, again, because that's what I'm talking about, long-term preservation and access, right? In order to access it, you need to preserve it. That means you need to we pull out here the folder information on the left, the original file name, the archived file name, if that had to change for a variety of reasons. We can search by path, again, and also the user can also search for path, the directory structure as well. We create SHA-256 checksums upon ingest. However, when files are written to tape, it's SHA-512. And so what we're doing is we're tracking both, as it is. So that way you'll see the fixed hash there on the bottom left, the algorithm SHA-256. We pull out the header information off the files, because that helps us then to really, truly verify and validate what file formats these are for future preservation and to run against our digital object obsolescence database. And then at the very bottom, you can see tapes. We make 3 tapes. This is from our demo thing, so it just shows 1. So it'll tell you exactly file 77901 at the very top, the file ID, that it's on that tape barcode number 7 and where it is. And so we can just go pull it out, and then we can restore the file for them. And then we can also then put in a tape and then see what all the files that are on it and spit out a list and see all the files that are on that tape and drill into the data. And I'm probably running out of time. DPX, you need to know DPX container information, and also as far as the individual files. So those are all the individual files, including, then we have individual checksums on each of those files. For preservation, you need to go down and drill at that level to make sure that they're all okay. View of the client portal then, so the clients will want to be able to see their data both in a directory structure as they're accustomed to seeing it, like here. They can also then search for files, just see a list of their files. They can export out their lists. They can search for Adi Geisiger as well, and there's Geisiger, and they'll pull up that one file, and then you can see there where it's pulled up, and they can see all their technical metadata. So just to wrap up then, those were just, again, examples about how you can, in order to preserve your assets going forward. So notice I didn't talk about content here at all, because again, it's content agnostic. It's a way then of trying to figure out how to preserve your assets in the future to access them using both structured metadata as well as unstructured metadata. Don't be afraid to not absolutely follow a metadata standard as far as like the descriptive or in your database, as long as you can map to all these different systems, for interoperability later on. And then perhaps integrate them with your content systems, which are doing all of that really cool machine learning data, all of that kind of data. But you still need to know what these assets are, not the content, but their characteristics so you can preserve them in the future and use them in the future.